This podcast is brought to you by Gensler Wealth. Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. The information discussed today is meant to be general in nature and not tailored to your specific investing circumstances. This means that you should talk to your regular Gensler Wealth advisor or your own advisor before acting on any information we discuss today. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be a solicitation, and past performance does not guarantee future returns. And stay classy, Toronto. Breaking news, this just in. Today on the Unlimited podcast, we interviewed Jon Erlichman, the anchor of BNN Bloomberg's morning program, The Open. We talk about life as an on-air financial journalist, what it takes to show up consistently every day, the secret to a great interview, what it's like interviewing Kobe Bryant and Robert De Niro. Stick around, we'll be back after this commercial break. Just kidding. Let's go. Well, welcome everyone to the Unlimited podcast. This one is scary for me, I must say, because I am interviewing Jon Erlichman, an expert interviewer, BNN anchor, and we're going to find out what life is like behind the camera in the financial journalist world. But I'm going to give it a try, and hopefully I'm not going to mess up too much talking to the professional. It's sort of like me playing tennis with Roger Federer. You know, I can hit the ball, but this is scary. Hey, Jon, welcome. Thank you for making the time.
Brian, it's a pleasure to be with you. I don't want you to be scared. This is a friendly environment. We're going to have fun. This is going to be a good time.
It's good.
Great
I
to
love
be
it. See, you're already, see, I'm supposed to make the guest feel like relaxed. You're making the host feel relaxed. This is why you're the pro and I'm just pretending. So let me, for the listeners, give a quick intro to Jon in case you don't know who he is. And in case, unlike me, you don't spend at least 2 hours a day watching him on TV, which I do from my office. So Jon Erlichman anchors BNN Bloomberg's morning program, The Open, which airs every weekday. He also serves as co-host of Bloomberg's global program, Bloomberg Markets, which airs weekdays as well. Jon has a background as a scoop-oriented reporter and accomplished interviewer of top global CEOs and a digital innovator. I'm going to make the bio quick, but not super quick because this is impressive. He's interviewed too many high-profile Canadian CEOs and business leaders to name, but he's also interviewed athletes like Connor McDavid, entertainers like Robert De Niro, Ice Cube, and Dan Aykroyd, entertainment industry players, including Brian Grazer, Jerry Bruckheimer, Disney's Michael Eisner. The list goes on and on and on. I don't want to keep Jon waiting here, but you get the picture. And so we want to just have a chat about what it's like to be a financial journalist and a few other key things that I wanted to cover with you today. So again, thank you, Jon, for being here. Really appreciate it.
That was fun. You took me down memory lane. Yeah, there's a lot of great interviews, and this is going to be a great conversation. So I appreciate joining you.
Okay, awesome. Amazing. And actually, speaking of memory lane, can you just remind me and give our listeners just a little bit of background? You've been in the business for 20 plus years, I think, but what was the path? How did you get here? And maybe some interesting stops along the way, just so folks know a little bit about your story.
Yeah. So I'm born and raised in Toronto. I went to the University of Western Ontario and I ended up studying economics there. And when I was graduating, I heard this business channel was starting up and I thought, that could be interesting because I'm interested in media. I'd done some work in TV and film in my summers. And I thought, I bet my dad would be proud if I went into financial television as opposed to just TV, broadly speaking. If I'm not going to be a lawyer or a banker or whatever, maybe that's the path for me. And I just started as low as you can start. I ended up getting the lowest job possible when BNN, which previously had a different name, was just getting going. And I loved every minute of it. I was getting coffee. I was doing whatever anybody needed me to do. And it was such a fun environment that I got hooked. So I ended up rising through the ranks over a period of years, got an opportunity to go to New York for BNN, or what used to be BNN's had a few iterations over the years. And after doing some great work with them in New York, I moved to Bloomberg and I worked covering the markets for Bloomberg in New York. I covered the 2008 financial crisis, floor of the stock exchange constantly. Ended up moving out to San Francisco when Bloomberg decided they wanted to really emphasize a focus on technology. It also happened to be a really gloomy time in the world. Everybody was really worried about the uncertainty after the 2008 oh no's, and tech was a bright light. So I ended up out in San Francisco, worked on a show that still exists today. It's now called Bloomberg Technology. It's gone through a few iterations. Spent some time in Los Angeles, moved into some broader reporting in LA. I worked with ABC News while I was there, worked on some startup ideas and ventures, and then got an opportunity to come back home to Canada. And this is where I've been for the last 7 years or so. And it's been an honor or privilege to work with BNN, which now has Bloomberg as a partner. So it's kind of come full circle, and also to work with CTV News. And yeah, it's exciting. The news is exciting. And that's a little bit of my own path.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Yeah, and so bringing it back to today. So, I said at the beginning, I see you on the TV every morning. It's up in my office. Would love to understand, what's a day in the life look like for you? Because you're on, you're there, you're on. I see it every day. How do you prep? How do you stay on top of what's going on in the world? How do you get yourself ready to be on air? All that sort of stuff. Because people don't necessarily know what it's like behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's not that glamorous, Brian. I'll be honest. I put on my pants like everybody else. It starts pretty early, and what you're trying to do is a few things. We know what our audience wants. They want to be informed. They want to be up to speed on what's happening that day. So you're really trying to key in on, okay, what are going to be the top stories today? What matters to our audience? We have a great team that helps us to get ready for the day, works very hard to get great guests that can complement our coverage. Some of those are in the moment. Maybe there's breaking news and someone comes on and talks with us. But a lot of times we're trying to plan so that we don't have to be scrambling in the moment. And we'll try to build out the show. It's kind of like making lunch or making a sandwich or making a salad, right? Like you might come into the day, you've got a few of the ingredients, you might have to get an extra ingredient, which that's some of the excitement of news. I'll be honest. A lot of us become these news junkies because you never know what the day is going to bring. So you have to kind of accept that. And you definitely, in live cable television, you have to accept that. You have to embrace the fact that you're going to have a plan in place, and you need to have a plan in place, but you might need to break it,
Mhm.
to follow where the news goes. So that's really where things come together, in working with our global partners. They've got their eye on even more stories that are happening globally. So you end up casting a wider net as I move into my afternoon, but starts pretty early. Work with our team in the morning, get our show to air, get off air, basically regroup, do it again in the afternoon, and reset, recharge, and get back at it.
Amazing. Well, yeah, it's funny you talk about, getting ready and things change and you're on every day. A little story for the listeners: when I first reached out to you and said, would you be so kind as to do the podcast? Maybe we'll have a quick call, I'll tell you what it's all about. And you said, sure. And then we had I do this with all guests. I have usually a quick pre-call before the podcast where we talk about what we might want to talk about and what I might put an agenda together. A lot of work goes into it, as you can imagine. And I got John on the Zoom, and he came on and he said, "Okay, are we going? Are we live?" And I said, so I mean, it gave me a pretty good indication of, you're a professional, you're ready to rock, which is pretty amazing. I just thought that was an interesting view into how you and your world might operate versus, us pretend interviewers over here. But let me talk for a minute about a theme that I've used in the past here. I did this especially, for example, with David Rosenberg, who I know you've interviewed a lot. It's sort of characteristics of successful people. And one of the, not to toot your horn for you, but one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you was because I think, at least from my vantage point, it cannot be easy every day, every single day without fail, getting up, getting ready, knowing you're going to be on. You have no choice. You have to do your best. You have to be live. Sometimes I wake up, I look at my calendar. If I have no meetings in the day, I feel pretty good. It's going to be a relaxing day. You don't have a relaxing day. And maybe you could just share for our listeners, like, what did it take to show up every single day, be on, be ready, no excuses? Because that, I think, is really a characteristic of a really successful person.
Well, they're very kind words. I appreciate it, but it's an honor to do this. And when you get the opportunity to do it, I think it's important to embrace it. There's not a huge number of opportunities to do this. So I think you have to respect the opportunity, right? Because there are a lot of people who want to be doing these things. So if you don't want to do it, somebody else is in line who might do it, right? I mean, in the same way that in any field, right? You have to have that motivation, especially if it's an area that has pretty widespread appeal, like the kind of appeal where someone might look at it and say, well, I'd like to do that. And so there is that aspect of it. If you're not going to do it, somebody else will. So be ready
Right.
for that. But I
Right.
think that just being consistent, and I've learned that over the years, that is one of the keys to success with everything, right? Like I have my good days, I have my bad days, but I know if you just keep pushing through and just stay committed to things, that good things do happen, right? And whether it's in investing, which is your expertise, whether it's in building a business, whether it's in your hobby or even your profession, like athletes, right? You can't do it all at once. And I think, some of your audience will know that there was this viral video of a very successful Milwaukee Bucks player after they lost in the playoffs recently, who mentioned essentially that you shouldn't think about losing as failure per se, right? You're
Right.
constantly adding and moving forward and learning. And so I think that if you can stay committed, stay consistent, you're going to find that you're constantly adding and learning. And, look, one of the things that's great about your podcast is your audience gets to learn so much. You get to learn talking to different people, and I get to do that too. So that's a motivating factor. Like if I get up and I get ready and I put on my best version of myself, I'm going to have a great day. I'm going to have a chance to learn a lot of things myself. And yeah, I mean, it means that once it gets pretty late in the evening, you better be making sure you're getting to bed, drink a bit of water, get a
Yeah.
little exercise, get your rest, all that kind of stuff. But it really is exciting. I mean, it's an exciting career, and I have to say, I'm lucky in the sense that, I have a lot of colleagues who work in broader news all the time. They're the ones who often have to drop everything, sometimes go to other parts of the country, other parts of the world. Most of the time, I'm privileged to be able to have a lot of consistency with where I'm going to be during the week. So again, it's a lot of fun, and that keeps me pretty jazzed up, to be honest with you.
Good. Well, that's those are some good words. I do recall during the heat of COVID, I guess, you were broadcasting, I'm gonna have to assume from some room in your house. I'm not really sure. But
Yes.
you were also nonetheless on every day. Any interesting sort of stories around how you had to deal with that? And I know you've got some young kids and how you kept them out off the camera.
Sometimes they were helping me, assistants behind the scenes. Well, it's funny. I think a lot about how all industries are evolving. I covered technology pretty extensively when I was out in San Francisco for several years, and media has obviously changed. The fact that your podcast exists and we can do this podcast remotely just speaks to that very fact. And I remember I used to be on location. We'd have these big satellite trucks that people would rent for astronomical amounts of money so that you could be live in the field covering whatever, an Apple event, this, that, the other thing. And it just reached a point where it seemed like it wasn't the most efficient use of resources, right? It was cool to be the journalist who had access to that, but it seemed like if you could do it in a much more efficient way, why not do that? Especially as phones got better. And I'd had some experience working with different live streaming platforms. There was one that Twitter had launched, and I'd actually, when I was in Los Angeles, helped to build a network on that app, kind of like a channel that was we programmed it almost as if it was 24-hour content. And I was primarily focusing on doing news coverage, and I did live streaming from one of the main Republican debates. This is in the lead up to the election where Donald Trump emerged victorious. And so when all of a sudden the early days of COVID, we didn't quite know what was going to happen, but wheels were in motion to think, well, gosh, if we have to keep the lights on and keep the TV airwaves full, but we can't necessarily be in the studio, what are we going to do? And candidly, I raised my hand and I said, look, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens if we're at home and we're doing the show through some more modest looking technology and find out what happens. And that's how it got started. And it went so well that we were able to really embrace that, so much so that, just to give, BNN Bloomberg in particular a nod, of all the cable channels that are out there. I mean, we were pretty consistent with having our hosts, our reporters, figuring out this technology, being live pretty much consistently for a very long stretch of time from home. But to your point, there's a new work method that you're working through. So I give my wife, Caroline, a lot of kudos for helping me in some of those nail biter moments. I have two daughters. They were great. Eventually, COVID feels like a blur now, but it was a long stretch, Brian.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
my daughters used to share a room, and as they got older, they said, Dad, that room that you're broadcasting in, we would like that so that we can have our own bedroom.
Right.
And so, I had to find a new spot in the house, but as a whole, look, I love being creative. I love, I love business. I love the topic of investing, but I also just love creativity. And even though COVID took away some of what we've traditionally done in media, it opened the door to just trying new things. And most of the time it was really fun. I will say though, to be back in studios now, to talk to people in person, it's hard to match the energy and the excitement that comes from that. And plus, like when we're trying to, hold people accountable, ask questions that bring out the most truthful answers, give our audience what they want. It does help to be in a real television studio with people right in front of you.
Yeah, for sure. So that actually plays into my next or leads into my next question. I like to understand what happens in the studio. There's lots of information flying. News is rapid, accessible by everyone every second on their phone. So, what type of environment does that create for you and your team as news is coming? Is it frantically trying to get new news out the door as quickly as possible, or what's life like for you and your colleagues in this sort of always available, always accessible news stream that people can get in the palm of their hands?
It's a great question. And we spend a lot of time and energy trying to navigate that because I think we started the conversation by talking about how I set up for the day. And, the truth is that you're building a relationship with the audience. Um, and that's the starting point, right? And we also talked about consistency. So part one for me is I need to build that level of trust with our audience that I'm going to be there every day and we're going to have consistency in how we do things. But we also talked about how you have to be ready for whatever the day brings. And you're absolutely right that the world we live in throws a lot of information very quickly. And so you try to balance what's new and how quickly do we get to it? And then how are we going to be able to deliver that? Now, right now, we're privileged. Let's just stay in the arena of financial news. We're privileged because Bloomberg is our partner and because they have spent decades building their own relationship with their users, which is rooted in trust, which means that they've got teams of people around the world that are spitting out headlines left, right, and center, but in a really thoughtful editorial way. So, as their partner, I have that tool in my back pocket. So if something breaks, I can turn to that and try to make sure we're on the right path. But, news is coming from everywhere. It's coming from social media, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot of in the moment trying to determine the news value, trying to determine whether or not we can deliver it just that minute or whether we need to take a little bit more time. And, we could go really inside baseball. We don't have to, but look, there's ways to determine what news is truthful, what requires a little more digging before we get into it. And I guess if we're doing it live on the air, you just get into the rhythms of knowing, right? It's just, in the same way that anybody who is a professional investor, they'll look at an income statement, they'll look at a balance sheet, and they'll know when the numbers or the descriptions don't quite add up. And so you just start to get a sense for that over time. And, beyond just having Bloomberg as our partner, which is fantastic. And the fact that I've got all these colleagues that are thinking in the same way in real time too. We all hustle around that. But it is a complicated world. And it is a world where, especially in financial markets, where people will take advantage of that. It's just a reality.
Yeah, and so you mentioned you used the word truthful before, and trying to figure out what's the right sort of info to share with your audience. There's a little bit of stuff going on in the media these days, Tucker Carlson and all this sort of business. What do you think the media's role is in general as it relates to sort of sharing information with an audience? And is it supposed to be just factual? Is it supposed to be editorial? Is it supposed to push an agenda? How do you think about it?
Well, I'm old school, Brian, and I became a journalist to report the news. It is a complicated world we're living in. And, I think that it's no secret that in some pockets of media, I would argue this seems to be more of a conflict in the United States than it is in Canada,
Yeah.
but that you have programming that is geared to audiences with very specific messaging to deliver on what they think that audience wants. Yes, I'm thinking about what our audience wants, but I'm lucky to have an audience that wants the news, right? And they want to know what's happening in the world that day. I think if we're talking about, particularly in the United States, agendas that are to the left or agendas that are to the right, that is really hard to navigate. And I've never felt that was my role. And so I think when you have this powder keg of social media and then very specific media that is very large and very influential in just delivering what they think that particular audience wants as opposed to what the news is, we're so well into that world. Like, I don't think there's any turning back from that. So I think that you have to understand that's happening and could even get more complicated as more technology is adopted. Even now, everyone's trying to figure out with artificial intelligence, what if it's not only that you have this view and that view, which is views, it's opinions, it's not even the news, but what if it's being delivered by someone or something that you think is someone, and it just further fuels, worries around misinformation. It's unavoidable that these worries are going to continue to populate, but I think you just have to be aware of it and navigate around it as best you can.
Okay, I got it. And you also mentioned something just now about sort of the daily, all the stuff coming at you all day. We're in just you and I are maybe on different ends of the spectrum in the sense that you're reporting every day, every moment, what's going on. I see in the morning it's 9:28, the stock market's about to open, and it looks good today, it looks bad today, it looks flat today. And I'm on the other side trying to think long term and tell my clients to think long term. Don't worry, even though I love watching you, almost don't worry what John's saying just at this moment, because like in the grand scheme of your investing, life cycle, doesn't really matter if the stock market is up or down today or whatever the case may be. How do you balance that? Or frankly, is your job to tell people what's going on at the moment and let me and others do the balancing?
So it's another great question, Brian. And look, I'll be honest, having worked in financial media for close to 25 years, I see all the flaws in how Wall Street operates, the same ones that you do. And let's use the Warren Buffett example, right? Like Warren Buffett is not catering to the Wall Street analysts. He's catering to people who he sees as his stakeholders, his shareholders. He's invested for the long term. He wants them to be invested for the long term. And he has routinely criticized the quarterly games that take place on Wall Street. So, in the same way that I have to report on all these things, I also have to try to navigate the fact that, like you, I think at least to a certain extent, we're speaking to people who have the same motivations. Yeah, on the one hand, yes, they want to know what's going on that day, but they probably are trying to make smart financial decisions tied to their future. And so it's finding a balance, I think, on what has happened in that moment and maybe just trying to provide some context when possible. And we do tend to try to get I suppose, that longer term thinking and that longer term narrative through some of the people we speak to, right? So, I think that let's say there's an earnings report one day and there's a lot of drama around that earnings report. Either it's really positive or it's really negative. I think you just want to try to explain at the very least what the drama is all about. But I think you also want to, if you can, make sure there is that context around what the ramifications are for that tomorrow and the next day. But, sometimes it's extremely misleading. And my time covering the technology world is a great example of that. Having worked, sure, covering Bay Street, but also covering Wall Street, the short termism that exists when, people are getting really excited in the moment um, can actually have devastating long-term financial implications. But I don't know, pick any of the largest technology companies that didn't dominate the landscape the way they do today, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And if you had based your investment decisions just around the headlines of that day, would you be better off today or not better off today?
Okay, good. Well, let me stop peppering you about questions about the financial sort of day to day and financial media. I want to be selfish for a minute, and maybe my listeners will find this interesting, but I want to talk about interviewing because there's one side of you, which is the expertise on the financial side when you're talking to your guests and reporting the news. But you're you're an anchor, you're an interviewer, and I'd love to hear maybe your top tips, and this is good for when people go and meet people or have interviews or are doing what we're doing right here, right now. Like, what in your mind makes, quite simply, makes a good interview as a start?
Well, I think there's a few
I should,
people that
by
are
the
in.
way, I should have asked you this as the first question. because then maybe I could actually run a good interview here. But at least we still got some time, so I can improve.
Listen, you have a wonderful podcast, and I think the growing audience that you've had speaks to the fact that you're having great conversations. So kudos to
Yeah.
you on that. So I guess I think about this again from what lens? If we're talking about the audience member, let's start there. I don't want to waste their time. I want to make sure that we deliver on the priorities that we set out initially. And we've talked a little bit about that. So I think that if we're going to have an interview, um, I have to consider what it is that the audience member is going to be interested in. And so you have to consider that before you've even decided about whether you're going to do an interview or not. Right. So there is that component. Once you're into an interview or you think this is an interview that is important, there's layers to that too, because some interviews are more casual in nature. That's not to say they aren't serious, but the stakes don't feel as high. It might be an interview just about what's happening in the markets that day, right? But sometimes you're speaking or interviewing a principal of a business or a member of government. And there are some higher expectations on what's going to come out of that interview. And not only that, people might be on the other side ready for those tougher questions, and it might invite a more tense conversation or a more combative conversation. So I feel like interviews, in many ways, they come in a wide variety of flavors, and you have to have kind of a toolkit ready for each one of them. I would say the biggest thing that runs parallel through all of them, if I could give your audience any piece of advice, because I think it holds true in any conversation you have in your life, it's when you can let everything melt away and you can listen, there's deep value that comes from that. And, for me in TV, when I was starting out, first of all, I didn't start out on camera. I was behind the scenes for a period of time. I love the production aspect, and going on television seemed a bit scary to me. And even once you're in the machine, there's a lot you have to get ready for. There's a lot of stuff happening. And it's only with time that that starts to melt away. You get used to the process, and then you can focus more on the interview. And then you slowly but surely can actually listen to what someone's saying. And the reason I bring this up, especially with television, is because somebody at home is not doing the interview. They are consuming that interview, which means that it's possible they might be more engaged in what the subject is saying than you are. If you're thinking about what your next question is, or someone just spoke in your ear and said, "Hey, fix your tie," or whatever it is, right?
Right.
So they're also keeping you accountable. So I think the ability to listen is really valuable, because whether it's a high stakes interview or not, if you're listening, you have a sense on where you can go. We don't always
Yeah,
take
and,
the
and
time
sorry, I
to
haven't been listening to anything you've been saying. That I'm going to start now. I'm ready to hear the big tip.
No, but it's easy not to listen, right? And I think it's because there's so many distractions. But listening is, I do think it's a superpower, because if you do listen, you'll be able to get from A to B. With some interviews, might take a while to get there. Some people might have very long answers. They might have a lot they want to get out. Other times you can get right to it. Listening is my number one takeaway after doing this for more than 2 decades.
Okay, amazing. I was listening to, by the way. I did hear it all.
I stopped listening to myself 10 minutes ago.
Okay, that's good feedback and good advice. Let's keep on the interviewing theme. At the beginning, I mentioned a good number of folks that you have interviewed in the past. I had to stop in the middle because I realized the list is so darn long. We'd be here forever just listing all the amazing people you've spoken to. if you think back, like, what would be the most memorable interview, or it might be a news event that you were covering, but in your career, when you think back, a couple really amazing highlights, people or events that you were covering, working on, interviewing, etc. Any good ones, good stories come to mind?
Well, someone actually asked me just the other night a similar question, and I'll share the same answer because it came very naturally, and I don't know where it came from, but it just came out. I had a chance to interview Kobe Bryant a couple of times
Oh
um,
wow.
when I was based in Los Angeles, and Kobe was a really fascinating interview because he's a lifelong learner and a very profound thinker. And, we talked earlier about having that consistency in our jobs, right? Like he's this person who had a high level of dedication towards continuously bettering himself professionally. And Kobe had a habit of quite literally cold calling people who he perceived to be successful from any industry. And it's it's actually, I mean, it's great advice, especially for people who sometimes wonder whether they can cross over that line. Kobe Bryant did. He would call up successful people in all fields and want to just pick their brain. And I thought that was a very interesting thing. What made him a really interesting interview is I interviewed him on a couple of occasions, once in connection with one of his shoe lines, which I think speaks to kind of the business and marketing brain that he had. One in conjunction with a documentary that he was involved with, and as much as I noted that it's helpful for the interviewer to listen, it's also helpful when the person you're interviewing is listening to the question and giving you an honest and sincere answer. And, I think that when you can see someone in a different light, and it's unfortunate in many ways because Kobe was just getting started on his business journey. And boy, did he have ambition and drive. And, we didn't really get to see the full extent of what his post basketball life could be. But, I think that really was a meaningful interview. I mean, in terms of moments in time, when you work in news and you're covering news, you get to be at a lot of these different touch points. And I guess if we're just keeping it, I mean, I've had an opportunity to cover some very dramatic moments in news, through my time with ABC and CTV News. But I guess in the business world, as I say, if we think about these cycles, to be at this point in my career and to be able to think back to what it actually was like during the financial crisis, that there is value, I think, in being able to draw back on that moment,
Yeah.
and I just remember that mood at the stock exchange on those darkest days, and we started becoming numb to the reality of like six, 7, 8, 900 point drops on the Dow, whatever it might be. And the uncertainty was palpable. And, we talked earlier about short term versus long term. This is an uncertain time, but this does not feel like 2008. And
Yeah.
I know that because I could feel that, and we could all certainly we all experienced that. So, it's a reminder too of all the rhyming in, especially in the business world, right? You just see these things over and over again, and it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Amazing. Good story with Kobe. Speaking of showing up every day, which we talked about, and characteristics of successful people, I do recall an interview Kobe did years and years and years ago. And I don't remember all the particulars, but basically the sum of it was he'd wake up, probably 2 hours earlier than most of his peers. He'd get a practice in or an exercise or whatever he does, eat a breakfast, do another one, stop something else, do another. Like essentially, he was practicing 3 times a day when most of his peers were practicing 2 times a day. And when you add up that extra practice over years and years and years, it creates a dramatic outperformance. And again, that's just the high level theme of what his interview was. But it's funny that you mentioned him because we were talking earlier about showing up and every day and doing the thing. So that's great. Any interviews where you were just simply starstruck? You know, I'm sure you have your particular things that you love and music you love and sports folks that you look up to. Any interview where you were like, oh my god, can't believe I'm interviewing so and so?
That's a great question. I try to be professional in all these settings. Again, I'm just going to say what popped into my mind.
Yeah,
Um, I interviewed Robert De Niro, tied to some of the work he's done with Nobu,
yeah.
and that was a trip, Brian.
Did he ask you you were talking to him? Did he say you talking to me? Just
Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah, that would have been something, right? Um, you know, he is someone who I have long admired the work he does, right? I'll watch just about every classic De Niro movie. He is not someone in an interview format who feels compelled to give the richest answers, which I love that, right? Like I love that people who are comfortable with who they are are going to be able to answer questions the way they want to answer them. And for celebrities in particular, where you to sort of make it in the industry, historically speaking, can you imagine how many of these interviews they've had to sit through
sure.
where, so I think that when you have to be part of that process a lot, you're maybe hoping for the conversation to go in a direction that might jazz you up in a way that you hadn't been before. And that's why, like, I've had a chance to do a lot of more business themed interviews with celebrities over the years. It usually opens up the door towards something that they are passionate about. I mean, like De Niro will be humble about the sort of the origins of the Nobu. I'm going to call it an empire. I mean, it really has become quite a powerful force over the years. But, being able to talk to him about that opened the door to stuff that he wouldn't necessarily get on, let's say, one of those press junkets, like, what did you think of the role and the character and
Right,
yada,
right.
yada, yada. So I thought that was really cool. But, yes, there was a moment where it's like, this is interesting. I'm talking to Robert De Niro. Yeah.
Unreal, unreal. Okay, well, we're getting close to the end here only because it is late on a Friday afternoon and you've had a full week of being on as you are. You know, at the end of movies, speaking near the end, at the end of movies, sometimes they do the blooper reel. We're not going to do a blooper reel, but any big bloopers or blunders or mishaps that you've had on air that you had to deal with, and maybe that's happened actually off air that the audience didn't see, but something crazy happened and you had to just go with it. Any good stories there?
Okay. Well, I'm going to stay on this theme of what pops into my mind first.
Okay.
Um, so I hope my Bloomberg colleagues will forgive me for this one, but years ago, we had a set built. It was in the middle of our newsroom. It was really cool, actually. But because they could film from a whole bunch of different angles, there were sometimes a moment where you could be in one corner, kind of at an anchor desk, and the camera was in the far corner. And my eyes weren't the best then. I have subsequently had surgery, which helps with that.
Yeah.
But I realized in the moment that I was reading a newscast on a prompter and I couldn't read a word of what was there. And I tried to look at the pictures that were being shown while we were doing the newscast. And that was a moment when I said, I think I have to really get this eye thing figured out.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
that's that one seems like a core memory. It's still with me to this day. But look, it happens, and it's just the nature of what we do is sometimes, and quite honestly, more often than not, you lose the audio connection. Something happens to your mic. I was on a shoot recently where our camera operator did such an impeccable job of somehow holding the camera while also fixing our guest's mic in real time with like his left hand while the camera was on his right hand. I mean, you have to stay calm under pressure. Now, we're not doing medical procedures here. I don't know how the doctors do that stuff, but
Right.
it's fun. It's actually part of the excitement, to be perfectly honest, in doing what we do. So I enjoy being part of the ride.
Well, yeah, the beauty of the podcast here, and the listeners would have no idea that we've ever had a blunder or a blip or anything because we could edit things out. Although we are pretty rolling here and don't do too much editing. But yeah, that's the other piece of being live. You never know what's going to happen. Okay, last question we ask everybody. Although I have a feeling I know your answer. Our theme over here is unlimited. Your wealth unlimited. We can help families with generally whatever they need on the wealth side. We can look at any investment. Our listeners have heard me say this over and over again. But so the question for all our guests are, if you weren't doing what you were doing, you have unlimited options in life. The world's your oyster. What would you be doing other than, being on my TV every morning, which I really appreciate?
Well, people probably won't know this, but I love music. And actually, in the last couple of years, I finally started recording some of the music that had been building up in me for the
Oh,
last 20
wow.
years.
Nice.
And that was a wonderful cathartic experience to do that, to get into a studio and to record some music because, you don't have to pick a lane. There's no path in life and there's nothing definitive, but sometimes you do have to pick a direction. And you know, Brian, I had the high school rock and roll band, and we all thought
Nice.
maybe, just maybe we'll take a shot at it. And it's mild regret, but it's funny. Like I actually put a little bit of distance between myself and music for many years because I love it so much. And I didn't want to feel like I wasn't having an opportunity to do it. So I was really happy to record that music and maybe I'll find a way to trickle it into the world
Yeah.
slowly but surely.
Well, send me a sample. Maybe it'll be the outro music to this podcast. Anyways,
There you
listen,
go.
John, I really appreciate your time. It's not lost on me that you, as I've repeated over and over again, you have to be on much of your day. It's probably a stressful thing, although it sounds like you love it. But you've taken an extra hour of your time to be on with us. I really, really appreciate it. Wish you the best. Can't wait to see you Monday morning on my TV again. Look forward to chatting soon.
Brian, it's been a pleasure. Congratulations on this wonderful podcast and your career too. And I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, awesome. Thanks very much.
The Unlimited podcast is hosted and produced by Brian Ginsler and is edited and mixed by myself, David McMillan. This podcast is not to be taken as investment advice. If you like what you heard, don't forget to rate the podcast and follow us on social media at Ginsler Wealth. Thanks for listening and see you next time.